I'm increasingly concerned about the slippery slope of miscarriages of justice, and my concern is about non-for-profit organisations. I'm very... that's probably my throat. I'm very concerned that a lot of money is bled from community or from public purse because of the loose adherence to what a non-for-profit organisation is really intended to be, and that now members of a non-for-profit organisation can pay themselves salaries. We've seen in various scenarios this being played out. Because I'm very concerned that we do need to return to community values and to actually really nurture community through a whole lot of sustaining, whether it's social enterprises, whether it's education, skills training, anything, that we need to tighten non-for-profit organisations and to make them truly reciprocal in the way they used to be when I was young, and I think they were genuinely adhered to in terms of their ethics followed through into practice. What specifics can you tell us that might help us in the very near future? So obviously non-for-profit organisations is an increasing way for communities to get, for activities for communities to function. How can we protect them in the future to be truly reciprocal?
Okay, thank you. Look, there is a Commonwealth agency that deals with this matter. Oh, here we are. Yeah, good. There is a charities organisation at the Commonwealth level that deals with this, and they've recently gone through, and it's because of the tax deductibility factor that not-for-profits, if you donate to them, you can get a tax deduction. So they found an awful lot of rorting when they went through these thousands and thousands of organisations, and they scrubbed a lot of them that were not functioning really as charitable causes or not-for-profit organisations. They scrubbed a lot of them off the list, and they lost their tax deductibility, which meant they died. But I think it's really because the whole corporate greed thing has sort of infiltrated through into the not-for-profit sector. That, you look at a public company now and the level of pay that executives are awarded is just shocking, it's stunning. I mean, the Fairfax CEO, the company quietly going broke, is on between 6 and 7 million a year with bonuses and extra little share top-ups and so on. It's a truly appalling, disproportionate response. And shareholders have basically lost control of the pay packets of senior executives, and senior executives regard the shareholders' money as their own, basically, and they just filch it in disproportionate ways. But I think I agree with you. I think it's funny. I had a mate of mine that I knew years ago, and he became a very big wheel in Macquarie Bank, and I ran into him in town one day. I was with my wife, and he said, "Oh yes, well, I said, "What are you doing now?" And he said, "Oh, I've left Macquarie Bank. I'm in the not-for-profit sector." And my wife said, "That's the same sector you're in, but journalism is not really not-for-profit sector." But I think it's something that no one really wants to address because there's so much money involved. And there's a few beauties that went under, like didn't Shane Warne's little charitable organisation go under?
Yeah, g'day, Brian Concan. Yeah, congratulations, Mr. ACKLAND, being one of Media Watch's presenters.
Yes.
Part of Australia's constitution. Good on you, mate. Integral part of Australia. Cheers. Yeah, well, my question's what I said before about Peter Dutton becoming Australia's next J. Edgar Hoover. What are your thoughts of that? The man truly scares me. He's become...
I think he's a very scary character. I think he must be on the autism spectrum somewhere. He just has no human empathy. there's no humanity. His eyes are dead. He looks like a lizard. And I think he's, probably an immigrant himself. It's one of those appalling things where a lot of new Australians or first generation Australians are vehemently opposed to migrants or refugees in particular. It's a strange sort of hiatus there. But he is I think an extraordinarily nasty piece of work, and I think the fact is that Turnbull is in such a weak position that this had been festering away for ages, to aggregate all these security agencies into one big portfolio and put the word home in it. And it goes to the nastiest, most right-wing sort of character in cabinet in order to that it's at least not antagonistic to Turnbull. So I noticed that Tony Abbott today on 2GB said, "This is a terrible move." Good on you, 10 flag Tony was out there, this is shocking. But God knows. I mean, made me almost feel sorry for George Brandis losing all this, because all George Brandis was the Minister for Homeland Security, that he appointed judges in his spare time. But basically it was ASIO and the Federal Police that came within AGs. He's got bugger all to do now. But Dutton will relish it, and unless he makes a big mistake. I mean, I can't really see Dutton being Prime Minister. But, I don't think he thinks that way. I think he thinks this is another step in the direction to the lodge, which is, you'd have to leave the country, really, if that happened. Sorry.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to make a comment that you might like to comment on, but I find it very ironic and contradictory that we have 2 senators with dual citizenship who have to resign, and their alternative citizenship is with Commonwealth countries. When we have a head of state who is a foreign woman from a family of inbred degenerate parasites, and a foreign head of state who was instrumental in sacking our democratically elected Prime Minister.
Yes. We're still waiting for the release of those papers by Buckingham Palace. Turnbull did apparently raise it with the Queen when he was over there recently, a couple of weeks ago, and apparently made a presentation about the Kerr papers that Buckhouse has and has been reluctant to release. These are the correspondence between Kerr, Prince Charles and the Queen's private secretary about sacking Gough. Look, it's ridiculous. I mean, Larissa Waters, as I understand, both her parents were Australian, but she was born in Canada. New Zealand doesn't have this provision that requires you to not have any dual citizenship. I don't think you need to be. You can be a member of the New South Wales Parliament and a dual citizen. It's only the Commonwealth Constitution that does this. And I suppose in 1901 it probably sounded like a good idea to, in a sort of fairly warlike environment, having people that may owe their allegiance to some other country, and in politics that was, not on. King O'Malley was a Yank in Labor Party. But I think the irony is you've hit it on the Queen, of course, and I think all these MPs are rushing to look at, ring up the Polish embassy or something to see whether they're... And the absurdity of it is that your DNA is still where it is. If you're a little Englander like Tony Abbott, you're always a little Englander. You'll always be jumping up and down for the Union Jack or the Queen. It doesn't matter that you've renounced it. So there's a sort of spiritual and emotional component to this that actually contradicts the sort of absurdity of having to shred your dual citizenship papers.
My question, how does equal access to justice for all and the barriers to equality and access contribute to miscarriages of justice? For example, in the United States, every person has a legal right to a lawyer, whereas in Australia, there are many who are forced to represent themselves because they are ineligible for legal aid, hopelessly underfunded, and cannot afford a private lawyer. And comparing Australia to other countries, there is the Innocence Project, extremely successful overseas, especially for their work in re-examining DNA and other forensic evidence to exonerate those who have been wrongfully convicted of serious crimes. Do we have anything comparable in Australia, and how effective is it? And do you think we need the establishment of a criminal cases review authority, independent of the courts and the executive, which would undertake further investigation into cases in which wrongful convictions are alleged? Similar commissions are operating in various forms in the UK, Norway and Canada successfully.
Right on. I think there's one in South Australia too. But I'm not sure how judicial it is, or whether it's an independent commission. But it was one of the terrible cases there where this guy had been banged up for years in jail for allegedly killing his wife in the bath with the pop-up toaster. But was it the Keogh case? It's quite a good system. If your wife's in the bath or your husband's in the bath, you drop an electric toaster into the water, they're frizzled immediately. But
What's the toaster doing in
well, you never know when you want a bit of toast. But yeah, I think there should be, because every prisoner thinks they're innocent, but there should be a criminal review process of some formal nature. There is, the guy involved in the murder of Newman, the politician, the Vietnamese fella, had a review, but it was done judicially, I think. Spiegelman had to nominate a judge to do it, and the judge found, it was all kosher, and the conviction was upheld. But I think, access to justice is one of our real big problems. They did have a case many years ago where the High Court said in criminal cases it's a requirement, in criminal case, absolute requirement for an accused person to have a lawyer. And that was the Dietrich case. And but legal aid has been starved of dough, so there's long waits to get a lawyer there, and so it goes. I think it's a real problem. It's interesting the Chinese, are sort of saying, well, there's a whole new school of thought from a lot of Chinese academics saying, democracy, we don't have democracy, we've got a central command sort of system in China. But what they really love about the West is the rule of law, that the institutions are separate, the courts are separate, and the courts can deliver stuff that's separate from what the executive and what the government of the day wants. So they're trying to develop a hybrid system where they have a centralised, a dictatorship basically, but independent institutions. So it'd be interesting. I think part of the time we've got a dictatorship as well. It's a sort of, the idea of democracy is a bit phony, that you turn up every 3 years to a ballot box, and this is our exercise in democracy, which has been entirely manipulated or gerrymandered, or people scared in all sorts of artificial ways. But nonetheless, at least we have the shadows and the outlines and the functions on occasion of an independent systems, whether it's ICACs or electoral commissions or courts. They're not beholden to the government of the day. So they're rule of law type bodies.
Hi, thank you, Richard and Stuart. I just I do get a bit of the feeling what I'm about to say will be eclipsed by Peter Dutton and what's about to, and his rise of this two-bit Gold Coast cop, and bent probably at that. But I've been looking through the Australia East Timor Association archives a bit. And it's interesting. I mean, there's something wrong with the discourse in this country. And I look at, and I would point to Murdoch partly and his lack of any merit in anything he does with the Australian and the concentration of the press. But for instance, Gareth Evans supported, the genocide in East Timor for years. Greg Sheridan, the same. They both have wonderful positions. It hasn't affected their reputations at all. And no one challenges them on this. You write to them, you don't get an answer back. And nowadays we have Amanda Vanstone. We remember the Cornelia Rao case, the Vivian Solon case, the bloke she sent to Belgrade for years. He'd never been there before, except for 6 months when he was born. Apart from all the usual human rights abuses of locking up innocent people, that's just standard for an immigration minister now. But she's got her own show on Radio National.
Yeah.
Because the Charter says nothing about human rights, so it's human rights neutral.
Yeah.
So that's all fine. She's balancing, presumably, Philip Adams, who says nothing about refugees anyway.
Yeah.
So I would just wonder about this balance. There's Julia Gillard being appointed the chair of Beyond Blue. She opened up Nauru and Manus Island, and she's destroyed I don't know how many lives.
Yes.
Human rights doesn't get a mention. If you destroy people's lives, that's cool, as long as you're a politician or something. I don't know, something's really wrong, and nothing gets said. There's no sharp intake of breath. There's no raising of eyebrows.
Yes.
There's no expressions of disbelief when these things happen.
Yes.
And we're becoming a bit numb. I think the best thing we can do is be like John Pilger, spend half our lives outside the country, and so we don't become sort of numb to it. Anyway, that's just I'm not sure if it's a question, it's a comment.
Very helpful.
Yeah,
No,
thank you.
it's a good look. Everything you say is, you sort of feel it in every corpuscle, really, because, I think the media has fallen in a heap on this sort of stuff, and politicians and journalists are schmoozed relentlessly, whether it's by the Israel lobby or the Indonesia lobby. Wasn't Sheridan, Tony Abbott wanted him to be an ambassador. It was either to Indonesia or Singapore, I've forgotten now, but it was, and they go on all these sort of trips to these hosted trips where they have this sort of pat view. There's quite a big Indonesia lobby among the foreign correspondent community, and it's regarded as important because it's a huge country with, probably the biggest Muslim country, and it's it's a struggling democracy. So we pay a lot of attention to it. So we tend to overlook various crimes. And of course, we've committed quite a lot of crimes as far as East Timor is concerned, particularly the bugging of the East Timor Cabinet Office during the Woodside negotiations. And Downer, when he was Minister for Foreign Affairs and had ACIS, the external security service under his control, authorised ACIS to bug the East Timor cabinet room so they could listen to the negotiations with Woodside, about the boundary for the gas and oil fields, how much to give, how much to let go, this sort of thing. And of course, they drove a very hard bargain. And Downer, when he retired as Foreign Affairs Minister, ended up as a PR man for Woodside on huge wicket. It's pretty smelly stuff. And the heart, I think, has gone out of people. Maybe it's an exhaustion factor. There's a hardcore of people that are still very concerned about refugees and asylum seekers being locked up. It's 4 years now, is it, on Manus and Nauru? And it's just unspeakable. But fortunately, some people keep banging away about it, but it's become such a sort of hardline political issue now. Labor won't move on it.
Can I just mention, apropos that, I'm not going to interfere with your question, Chandra, but I've mentioned before that there are 250,000 university students live in this city. And if only a small percentage of them were irate about the sort of issues that Stephen has raised, and even if they were merely dismayed, then that would be a step forward. I merely make that comment. Okay, Sheldon.
Yeah. Look, demonstrations work. I mean, you look at the French, they love a manifestation. They're out on the streets demonstrating because the price of tram tickets went up or something, you know, and they don't. They come back down again. And these huge demonstrations, and they seem to have an effect.
I just want to ask you about the recent stoush that two Liberal ministers had with a judge, with the court system, and had to, was it 3?
Yes.
And it was contempt of court, and finally they had to apologize, and I gather under duress. I mean, they were kind of forced by their own party or something. Now, my question is this a case of the political Liberal elites testing the waters to what extent they can bully a judge who, according to their view, gives a judgment not as per their values? So is that something that we might see more and more? I mean, if the Liberal had a larger majority, let's say, not just one, would these people would have apologized? I'm just raising this question.
I think it's a very good point, whether they'd apologise if they had a bigger majority. I mean, at the time of the Mabo decision, I remember the High Court was under attack, you know, when it brought down the Mabo. This was a shocking piece of judicial activism. And Tim Fischer, the Deputy Prime Minister, was saying we need a capital C Conservative on the High Court. This is terrible. Giving these Aborigines all this land was just it'll ruin us. And of course that's when Ian Callanan was appointed, the capital C Conservative. But it was very interesting in the case you mentioned with the 3 politicians from Victoria and all in the government. Oh, sorry, I have to turn my phone off. That's my daughter. Sorry. I'll put her in my pocket. So the point being is that the court actually hadn't made a decision. It was a Court of Appeal hearing on the sentencing of people that had on terrorism offences, and there was a discussion in the Court of Appeal about the disparity of sentences between New South Wales and Victoria. In New South Wales, in terrorism cases, the allegation was they didn't take into account the age of the offender, the youth, the prospects of rehabilitation, all these sort of things. So they were given longer sentences. And so it wasn't as though the court had actually decided anything at the time. These attacks on the judges, they're personal attacks. They were ignorant, they were stupid, they were lefties, you know. They were personal attacks and it put the judges in the terrible position, because if they dismissed the Crown's appeal on the sentencing of these prisoners, they would look as though, you know, they were rejecting and reacting against the political demand, and if they increased the sentences, they would look as though they were currying favour with the political demand. So it was a sort of no-win. You can understand why they're upset. In the end, they did jack up the sentences a little bit, but I think you're right, they apologised because, you know, if you're contempt of court, you ran the risk of losing your seat in Parliament. And it was an interesting branch of contempt of court. It was called scandalising the court. Very rare, you know, these cases. And there was a Law Reform Commission report done on contempt in which scandalising the court was discussed, and it went back to the 18th century, where some judge says the courts must be kept in a blaze of glory. So therefore, any criticism of the courts was diminishing the blaze of glory and would be scandalising. I was hoping the case would come on so we'd have a really good decision about scandalising the courts. But I think the judges just really wanted to put the wind up them and get them to back off. Yeah.
Good evening, I'm Joffrey. And I'd like to start with questions. The questions would be, are these cases of a miscarriage of justice is justice delayed, justice denied in these cases. And I'm talking about two particular cases. One would be the historical and economic injustices still ongoing with the Aboriginal Australians. They're not mentioned. I mean, I think the history of Australia, most of the scholarly stuff is still neglectful of the oppression and abuses committed on them. And the second would be international justice with regard to Julian Assange in particular. Here is an Australian exposing the oppression of a foreign power. And here we are with a government willing to cooperate with that foreign power to prosecute him, and not really taking into account his endeavor to expose the truth. Are they also not miscarriages of justice? Thank you.
Yes, I think one of the great things that's going on at the moment is that there's this Royal Commission into Indigenous youths and children in detention and their treatment in the Northern Territory. This has been an extraordinary thing. You know, it was set up after the Four Corners thing on the Don Dale detention centre, where children were being manacled and cuffed and treated very badly. And Turnbull reacted immediately, one of the good things he did, and set up the Royal Commission. And it's been an incredible journey because it has exposed the whole culture of the Northern Territory, not just the government, but the judges, the judiciary, the lawyers. It's just a rotten machine that Indigenous youths come before the courts all the time for drunkenness or petty crimes. They're put away. Next, it's this sort of remorseless machine, and there's been never any serious and sensible attempt to address the root causes of it. And everyone's on board. No one wants to buck the system. Their careers are in jeopardy if they suddenly say, oh, well, you know, I think we should be a bit more caring or concerned or have some other agenda or some sort of remedial process here. But no, it's all part of a psyche, part of a culture. And the Royal Commission, I think, has done a good job in exposing that. And I'd be very interested. They haven't reported yet, but they're not far off. And I think it's going to be a real breakthrough. And of course, whether the Northern Territory government, which has just enculturated both sides to this mistreatment, will actually respond will be interesting to see. But I think the Indigenous incarceration is one of the great shames of this country, along with treatment of refugees. Even in New South Wales alone, I think the incarceration rate for Indigenous people has gone up 25% in the last sort of 8 years or so. It's extraordinary. And there's numerous conferences about it, and no one seems to know what to do. Restorative justice is one campaign that seems to be working in Moree, where particularly young people are taken aside, and instead of being sent to jail, all sorts of other processes are put in place. A bit like the drugs court, I think, where you can avoid detention if you fulfil certain sort of requirements and report back all the time, and it seems to work. So Assange, yeah, a very tricky situation there, because I noticed that his lawyer from Sweden said, oh, well, now that the Swedish government's dropped the prosecution or the inquiry, he hasn't actually been prosecuted for anything but the inquiry into this alleged rape. Sweden has very interesting definitions of what is rape. But he said, oh, he can walk out of the embassy tomorrow. It's free. He's a free man. Well, there's obviously something else going on there. Why he hasn't walked out? And I suspect it's because he's breached British bail requirements. When he went to the embassy, he was on bail, and his bail condition was that he, report regularly. He was being looked after by quite a wealthy fellow in a estate in Norfolk, I think, and the Frontier Club, and so he breached that. So he walks out, he's back in jail, I suppose.
Richard, how do you think Eddie Obeid is going to go with his appeal?
I've lost track of Eddie. So he's in jail now on the kiosks and cafes at Circular Quay. Then there's the coal case coming up. He had a civil case against ICAC in the state of New South Wales, which I think he has lost. But there's, he sued them for misfeasance in public office, which is an offence that only Eddie would know a lot about. But that seemed to go. Jeffrey Watson was a defendant in that. IP, the commissioner, the state, and a couple of ICAC officials of ICAC. The case was thrown out against everyone except two ICAC officials. It was sort of left vaguely open, and I think he's pursuing it. He must have a lot of money to keep pursuing these things. And so he and Moses Obeid are next up on the Mount Penny charges, and I don't know when that comes on, but there's an awful lot of stuff in the pipeline with Eddie, and only I'm not sure where he is with his cafe appeal, and he maybe have served his time by the time that comes, if there is an appeal, I don't know.
Exploring the elements of injustice within Australian society can be a bit depressing. So I wanted to raise some questions about more positive things that might be done. Obviously I have to preface any remark by saying thank God for Media Watch and perhaps for the ABC more generally, notwithstanding its limitations. But also I think for the Saturday paper. Frankly, I'm remarkably surprised that it's been so enduringly successful. And it seems to me these are indications that there are opportunities for alternative voices, cogent voices, progressive voices to be heard. And I'm wondering what can be done to build on those kind of strengths for a more general cultural shift that involves a critical perspective on these injustices.
I think, look, Australia has precious few national institutions, of a sizable clout. The ABC is one of them. Where do you go after that? CSIRO is an important national institution, but I think the ABC probably even ahead of that, but very important. It's surprisingly gratifying that Saturday paper's doing well. I'm told by the editor it's in profit, which is remarkable. The Australian's been going for, on a much bigger scale, of course, huge scale, but been going for long time, and it sort of has, I think it struck profit for a brief period in the 70s and hasn't been in profit much since then. They boast now that it's sort of back in profit, but it's been a huge loss-leading publication for a long time. And the Saturday paper, by just doing good journalism, sort of quite long for just concentrating on good journalism, identifying its issues and sticking with them, it's found a good market, and I think as long as the journalism's good, it'll keep going. Maybe Gadfly column may be an exception to good journalism, but it's just I sort of feel like I'm sort of writing for a school newspaper, with all the sort of attacks on my enemies and things like that. So-and-so didn't pick up a lolly wrapper in the playground, get stuck into him. But, it's fun. But the paper is good, and it's run by a very able young editor, not even 30. It just puts everyone to shame that you can do these things when you're quite young.
I hope you don't mind me having another bite of the cherry. You just mentioned about demonstrations. I love demonstrations, manifestations. I think the French have got the good word for it.
They do them well,
Yeah, but I think we can do a lot more than that. And what I realised when I was looking through the East Timor Australia East Timor Association archivers. We did a lot of other stuff as well. And letters to the papers it was then. I don't know if that's still current, but I still do it. And for instance, I would write the other day to bloody Barry Cassidy on the Insiders. What a terrible name for a program. And when he was asking, talking to Julie Bishop, because Australia wants to become, this is unbelievable, chairperson or the head of the Human Rights Commission. I mean, and all he did, all Barry Cassidy says, is he referred to the Labour Party. So the Labour Party wouldn't agree that the human rights issues in Australia are very good. It's not the Labour Party. The Labour Party have got no credibility whatsoever. It's the human rights organisations have some credibility. So I wrote to him, I said, you don't seem to know about being a journalist. I mean, you're meant to be on our side, not quoting other... He got it all wrong. Anyway, I was a bit... it was polite, but anyway. I just want to talk about... So we'll maybe get a reply, but we should just have a go. Just have a go at it. And also support the Saturday paper. I completely agree with that. I always buy it. Support the Green Left Weekly. I think always buy it. It needs support. You try and sell it in the tunnel. 100 people walk past, one will buy it if you're lucky. So we should support the stuff that supports us, even if it's not perfect. Yeah. As long as it's not Murdoch. I don't agree with the Sydney Morning Herald, because on the 16th of last month they said they agree with offshore processing, as long as it doesn't do people any harm.
Oh,
well,
that's
fine.
As long as it doesn't.
Yeah, I don't know
the harm has been done.
Yeah.
I mean, I also, the High Court actually hasn't been very strong on this at all. In one of the more recent cases that was taken on behalf of a long-term detainee offshore, the High Court said, well, look, it's the length of time that's the factor here. If people are incarcerated for a long period of time without charge, without trial, that is a concern, because that breaches, the Chapter 3 provisions of the Constitution, the judicial powers. They're our powers, they're not executive powers. So you're locking people up in the name of Australia. If it's this sort of indefinite detention, then that is going to be a constitutional problem.
It should be.
But the fact is, it has gone on. It's gone on for what point do you cut this off and say 4 years, 3 years? It's too long. And I think we're getting to the point now where someone will bring another case that says we've been detained too long, and this has now become a Chapter 3 problem.
Well, I've written to the Saturday paper about a Bill of Rights. We need a Bill of Rights. Sorry, and just one more. I mean, that's just a no-brainer.
I agree with you.
That's what we obviously need at some point. God knows how much worse it will get. But also, I was corresponding to a friend in Broome, Western Australia, and they knocked on the head the James Price Point thing. They won. They won the campaign to stop the gas hub at James Price Point, and they did it through huge involvement and creativity. And it was just brilliant. They published a book about it, which I said I'd review for them, but I haven't done it. Yeah. But it's really, you can do these things. We shouldn't.
You can.
There's huge amounts we can really do. Yeah. The students will find their creativity, but when?
But if there's political traction for things, it does work. And, local politicians, particularly at the local level, do respond if there's enormous upset. They do become impervious too, like this WestConnex. People just, it's an abomination what they're doing. But, the state, and I think they're just in the pockets of these, road builders and tollway collectors that, that are going to reap a fortune out of it. And they've gone along with it. I mean, look at this ridiculous proposal to build a massive highway to Illawarra, which costs billions more than putting the train, upgrading the train. And Abbott's view was, roads are good, and it all went back to Bob and Santa Maria. Roads are good because people are in cars and they're individuals and they're free. But if you put them on trains are run by unions, and that's socialism. That's bad. You don't want trains.
Really, please, everyone go and see this. What a fantastic exhibition it is of our history, which we don't know about a lot, in many cases. Well, lots of things were revealed to me. And yeah, we've got to support our trade union movement because that will actually flow through to the legal system, to all the other things, Bill of Rights and so on.
Who led the strike in 1917?
It was the railway workers in Everleigh.
Okay.
It was launched from there. There were, if you go down there, you'll see something phenomenal. You'll see rallies of 100,000 people every week, and daily processions. It's something and that was when Sydney had a population of 700,000. 700,000. So, so anyway, my main feeling coming out of that is we must support our trade union movement, and I think that'll lead on to other victories. Okay, thank you.
Okay, folks. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. The questions have been first rate, the discussion has been first rate, and Richard has been a very significant catalyst for that. Now, next week, in terms of, it's got a kind of justice edge to it. We're going to be talking about the guaranteed minimum income scheme. The speakers are John Tomlinson, formerly from QUT, and G.G. Foster, who's an associate professor at UNSW, and Professor Frank Stillwell is going to be in the chair. I will be merely taking the collection in the interval. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much, Richard.